everyone. We are so excited to have a guest on today. We've got Christa Biegler, an award-winning dietitian and nutritionist, host of the Less Stressed Life podcast, and author of the Eczema Relief Diet and Cookbook, which I own. She helps health-savvy women overcome food sensitivities and fatigue without restrictive dieting to beat bloat, burnout, and eczema breakouts. She lives with her unicycling husband and kids in the Midwest. The Less Stressed Life podcast and nutrition mission is that everyone deserves a less stressed life without inflammation, food sensitivities, and fatigue. Christa is not only a brilliant colleague and provider, but a dear friend of both Jilly and myself. She is a wealth of information that is always delivered in a clear and direct way, which we so appreciate. And we're so excited to have her with us today, diving into the topic of your health is only as good as your nervous system. Very excited for this one. So how we kind of like to open up all of our guest episodes is really to ask you about kind of your personal story, especially because so many of us in this, especially functional medicine field, have kind of entered into it through our own personal experience. And I know your experience is, definitely part of what kind of brought you to this space. So I'd love to hear a little bit about it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, first of all, because I always appreciate the opportunity to share lots of random tangents with people and analogies. Let's see if we can be on our game with that today. But my story was that I was inspired to go into, I was foraying into my own private practice. I had a massive thing happen, like a massive skin breakout that happened. I'm going to save you the details on it because I don't think it's as interesting, but some details of note was that I had a couple small children. I was working and starting a second business in life, right? So I think that those were pieces that contributed. I don't think stress is ever not showing up at the party. It's just a matter of how much is it showing up at the party and what systems is it taxing. So long story short, I overcame the massive skin outbreak. It took a while because I could not find someone to help me with it expediently, even though I went to lots of practitioners. I ended up having to dive into the research and use myself as a guinea pig, as does happen, which does kind of suck because it does take much, much longer if you were guinea pigging yourself. And then I'm like, cool, I'm great, right? And so I move on with my life. And then probably a couple of years ago, I became aware of mineral analysis, HTMA. And this was kind of all, and actually I'd been introduced to it in 2009, but forgot about it and thought it was hokey. So as a side note, but so this was all intersecting with the time where I was seeing clients, what was causing people to relapse? Why would they relapse if they were doing better? Mm-hmm. And so part of that was sluggish thyroid, which cannot, your thyroid cannot be optimal in the presence of stress. It is not possible. What happens is your alarm clock, or TSH, is secreted from your pineal gland. It goes out and talks to the rest of your body. And then T4, this is a very, very watered down version, but T4 is getting ready for work during the day. And then it checks into the cell as T3. And let's say it gets distracted and stressed on the freeway. It drives down the wrong exit ramp and it becomes reverse T3. So it cannot even check into the work. It cannot even check into the cell if there's stress present. So that's no, we can all love on our thyroid, but the other things have to be in balance as well. So what I was seeing is when you have sluggish thyroid, you can have sluggish motility. So it's like bird bath water, right? It's very stagnant. And so then you have stagnant gut stuff. And so I was seeing repopulation and just kind of relapse of symptoms happening. And I was looking for reasons for this because I was under the impression that my clients that had thyroid issues, their doctor was addressing it. Or then there was the next level of, well, let me order labs or ask you to run labs. And that had its own pile of issues. And then sometimes it didn't show up on blood labs, but man, the symptoms were still there. And so looking at what we see subclinically or before it shows up on labs became a really important piece. So why did this all matter? Because I thought I was fine. I was like, I'm good. I don't think I'm stressed, but I had, my eyelid would twitch sometimes, just sporadically. And I know that that's a magnesium deficiency symptom, right? As is restless legs and any kind of really like twitching, right? Muscular twitch. And then that's the thing with minerals in general, is like twitches, like irregular heartbeat. I had that stuff, throughout life. And so I knew that the eye twitching was definitely an issue. And I was so pissed about it because the name of my business was Less Stress Life, which was really a synonym for an inflammation that I picked out in 2017 kind of randomly. But I think it's funny how things come full circle and they manifest, etc. So why is this important? Because I'm like, I do not feel stressed. I feel fine, but yet my body is giving me signs of this. Well, I had unrealized stress. So I checked my mineral status, which is kind of really the benefit of that is it's just a wake up call where it's showing you like, oh, you've actually dumped out. The side effect to stress is that you dump out minerals. And when you dump them out, you can't do anything right? Because they tell your enzymes what to do, and your enzymes tell everything else in your body what to do. So I got my mineral test back, Abby, and I saw that my minerals that indicated that I had long-term stress were just totally bottomed out. And those minerals were huge for digestion. And they were huge. I knew I had some issues because after some stress, I'd have like intermittent burping. And so where else you would see this in practice is that people would take enzymes or they do stomach acid repletion, et cetera, but it wasn't really helping them forever. It's because stress suppresses stomach acid. It suppresses digestive enzyme status, it suppresses other things. So when we're talking about how it's like this rate limiting factor, it's like, well, those little tools could help in that moment, but what would help more long term? And so the story is like, I was my favorite client. My adrenals were not an ideal place, So I was able to see that really quickly. I was able to see that the things that made my digestion work, the things that made my that helped my thyroid check into the cell, that helped glucose work, I didn't really resonate with a lot of certain thyroid symptoms, right? I was like, oh, I'm not like overly fatigued, but I feel like I have ADHD. Which to me, I'm like, what if your thyroid is just sluggish? Which is, so as I started to support my thyroid, I had like insane focus. And so I told that in kind of a roundabout way that I was annoyed, like I needed a little bit of a come to Jesus experience to realize like, oh, even what I was doing was being read by my body. And I remember talking to one of my senior mentors about this. I'm like, man, let me ask you about this eyeball twitching. Like, I haven't taken magnesium for a while. And he's like, sometimes we don't think we have stress that we do. Like, and I remember him telling me, like, running from appointment to appointment to appointment. And I was like, yeah, I do that all day long, right? Doesn't every practitioner, right? I mean, I think the nurses like get this the worst because it's like even if they're parents, because they're getting constantly asked for things at home maybe, and then you get to work and it's like constant like interruptions and being asked for things at work too. And so even though it's your normal, it's still like hitting your body in a different way. And so just getting to the point of awareness around that was like a huge uphill thing. So the word stress doesn't always resonate, right? Because as high, like career driven or high performance women, we're like, well, yeah, maybe. And you were talking about this off air, like, yeah, maybe I have stress or maybe I have this, but I can't do anything about it, right? Or you telling me I have stress stresses me out more because I'm trying to meditate, but I can't, like, I cannot focus on meditation. So all of these things are things I've heard so often. And I remember telling a girl, like she was telling me about this tension headache thing. And she'd had a physical manifestation in her body that was like a painful jabbing in this one really awful spot. And so I was like, but that signal alone is talking to your brain and like giving you the impression of stress. And so you're getting, why did we know it was like stress stuff? Because she was getting a headache and magnesium resolved it. It was like, well, this could not be more clear in every which way. Right. And so it was really, trying to figure out how to finesse and talk about the subject and make it sexy and make it to relevant, because guess what? It is relevant to everybody. So coming up with ways that we can recognize and understand it in ourselves is the only path to transformation for us, because we all have this at some level. And so, but it's like, what are we going to do about it? Right. And if we are ignoring it and sticking our head in the sand, as we all like to stick our head in the sand on some things, sure, I certainly do, on certain things I don't want to deal with, the longer we do that, like what I was seeing is, the bottom line is I was seeing relapse. And I'm an achiever and I don't like relapse. I'm like, I want to win all the time, right? So I want someone to get better. I want them to stay better, right? And so I went looking for, well, what in the heck is going on? Like, why would people relapse? And so that's kind of where this sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole. And then I realized I wasn't very good at communicating about it, because I would be like, well, this is stress, girl. Like, your headache is stress. And she's like, well, you telling me that makes it worse. I'm like, okay, we got to figure out something else, right? That's not working. So in a nutshell, in a long-winded nutshell, that was some of my story.
And I think your story is, I mean, it's definitely relatable for Abby and I in our own healing journeys, but I think likely super relatable for our listeners in that, you know, a lot of our audience are, you know, high achievers, people who are like, go, 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 and may not always see the day-to-day to-do list and racing from this to that as stress. And as you mentioned, you know, awareness and, you know, making that connection in your own body is really the first and kind of most important step, which we'll be talking a little bit more about. But before we kind of dive into talking more about, you know, kind of, you know, unrecognized stress and how it manifests and all of that, would you mind giving our audience just like a little bit of a refresher in terms of, you know, what exactly like is the nervous system, and, you know, why is this such a barrier for so many people on their health journeys?
So our nervous system, and actually I don't usually bring this part, but your nervous system innervates everything, right? So like the nerves go through everything, the organs, the muscles, etc. So they're going to affect anything. And what we are familiar with is our parasympathetic nervous system and our sympathetic nervous system. Maybe more familiar with rest and digest and fight or flight. And it's just like flexing a muscle. If we are running around from appointment to appointment to appointment, our brain is getting the messaging that we are in fight or flight. When we have that going on, our body preferentially moves resources, blood, etc., to the periphery to run from the tiger, because it wants to put 100% of its energy and effort to survival. Our body has really a couple of functions: survival, aka staying safe, and often reproduction, right? Like this is like a mammalian thing, right? So like these are things that our body is going to do. So if it's like not feeling safe, it's like, well, I don't really have the resources for that issue, you know, that secondary thing. I'm certainly not going to reproduce, right? So when we're flexing our fight or flight side a lot to where it becomes so common, it's just our norm, and we don't really see it as an issue, or we don't really see it as an option, that it's different. The other side, just like muscle, right? Like muscle very quickly atrophies when it's not being worked, unfortunately for us all. So I don't care if you worked out really hard 20 years ago, that is really irrelevant if it wasn't like this week. So the same thing happens with our nervous system. I try to talk about the nerve just like a muscle. So if you're not flexing that nerve, if you're not flexing rest and digest, then how in the hell could you ever digest things, right? And if you can't digest things, you can't absorb things. So that's a really slow breakdown. That's like chronically, like just a little more tired, just a little more less awesome, just like not as optimal as you could be, because it's a slow breakdown. It's kind of like if you don't ever do maintenance on your car, it may not fall apart like all at the same time, but like little things might pop up and be like, it's fine. You just ignore it, right? Until it becomes more and more and more. So that's one way I kind of describe it. But another way to think about it is that we're constantly being fed information, like thousands of pieces of information that are unconscious to our body at any given moment. And so our body's constantly trying to process this and look for danger, right? So we've got our parent brain, our prefrontal cortex, and we've got our amygdala, our limbic brain, right? And so, and there's a couple ways to talk about this, but as we age, which we're all aging, our prefrontal cortex atrophies or is like not as good, like it cannot be in like as great of a spot. So when we're not practicing exercising the rest and digest side or the calm side or whatever, like practicing what we call neuroplasticity, which is being able to flexibly go from like carrying a whole bunch of heavy groceries from your right side to your left side for an analogy purposes, right? Like, oh man, I didn't work out my left side, so I can't even carry anything on that side, right? If you can't switch between those two, you get kind of stuck in your ways. And this happens in aging populations anyway. So like stuck in your ways. It's really hard to like get out of fight or flight. Like we can't even imagine it not being out of fight or flight, right? Like we're not really flexing, improving, stimulating that other side, which is where all health and healing occur, right? Like in the rest and digest state, that is where recovery happens. So if you're constantly running and you're never recovering, our body's pretty incredible. So it's like gonna hang on as long as it can, but it will start to break down in different places. So anyway, one other way I'm kind of trying to talk about this is that our body is like 95% unconscious. Like all of these things, like our heart is beating without us thinking about it. All these things are happening without us thinking about it. We think that we can just think ourselves in and out of things, right? Mm-hmm. But really 5% of us is conscious. And so just knowing that you're unconscious, so basically the messages coming into your nervous system are what pretty much control what's happening. It's a really big deal. And so there's like, when I'm talking about this, and I'm talking about the bucket of inflammation, because I'm looking at all these things related to inflammation, there's several things that feed into the bucket of inflammation, but the big one is how safe your nervous system feels. So that would be the easiest way to think about it, is how safe does my nervous system feel, or is it getting messages of threat? Like, do I have time to have a break between things? Or is like, am I just like running a marathon all day long, right? I can give lots more examples if you want, but that's the bottom line. How does my nervous system interpret this information is what you're looking at. Because like, how is my unconscious perceiving safety so it can like stop and heal? Because if it's not in safety, then it's going to be in chaos, and immune chaos, I mean, eventually manifests into autoimmune conditions. So bit of a tangent. I don't know if that helped, but we can talk about like how your body perceives information if you want.
Well, that's so helpful to like get that really painted of like our nervous system, which feels very untangible for most of us, actually has a very tangible relationship with our physical body, of just as you said, like eventually left with the, slow breakdown of the car or, whatnot, is like can end in like autoimmune and can end in like inflammation and can end or, be inflammation that can end in a bigger diagnosis of sorts. And I think that piece of, what is like, okay, running around, not breaks between like sessions or always being kind of berated by the responsibilities that someone might have in their life. Like, I know you've talked about, and I thought it was like so important, even like our own like shoulds and coulds and woulds, like our own perception of the demands on us, or of, that kind of that unconscious brain or conscious brain, I guess, but sometimes the way we even talk to ourselves. And those can be some of those unrecognized stressors. I feel like it might be helpful to like tease out maybe what are some other examples of those unrecognized stressors, even like the perceptions that we have of our own thoughts in our brain.
Everything is a perception, first of all. It's all about our thoughts. And so it's funny because the really cool part of life at the moment for me is that all of my worlds are really intersecting a bunch. So like yesterday I went to, I went to this small group. It was Bible study, but I've been doing this with these same girls for a long time. And one of them grew up in a divorced household, and she always viewed herself as not like never having a place, right? And never being wanted from like one place to the next. That's what her nervous system and body was perceiving. And how that's manifesting as an adult is that a lot of things for her are like the worst case scenario, or of course that would only happen to her, or of course she would be the only one responsible for XYZ thing on her desk or whatever. So for her entire young life, she didn't feel like, her nervous system did not feel safe. And for example, she gives examples about like her stepmother, and this can happen with any parent, right? Or any relationship. I mean, really, I believe that life is mostly about our relationship with ourselves, and that mirrors our relationship with other people, honestly. So you could apply this to like any example you want. But basically, like this is such a common example that people maybe might resonate with, or maybe like see other versions. Like, what I say about that situation, or what Abby says about some kind of situation, is different than someone else who's at the same party or same event, or like was around that person, how they perceived it. So we have these opportunities to stop and talk about these things. So she talks about how I never really felt wanted. I never felt this. So what this looks like in her adult body is it does look like autoimmune conditions, but it just looks like this kind of worst case scenario, catastrophizing. And honestly, until you get out of those situations, you don't really realize that they're kind of like not the best empowered, most optimal state. For example, in my family that I grew up in, I remember, being in the skydiving club in college, and I remember my dad chastising me for like, this is so stupid. You have a child. Like, what are you doing? And I was like, damn, buzzkill. Like, you are just like, you are catastrophizing everything. But I didn't really think about it because I spend so much time away from my parents and family that until I'm around them after being really absent from them in a long time, I don't really realize that they all catastrophize, right? Or they all kind of like are like I grew up in a fixed mindset household. I remember getting the book, I think is it called Mindset? It's Carol Dweck's book. I remember getting that as a gift one time. Yeah, maybe. Is that what it's called? Growth mindset? Either way, it talks about growth and fixed mindset. And I only read like half the book and I was like, oh my gosh. And this was years ago. And it was like everything we experience is like, should help bring us to this new level, right? So like that book at that time was a really pivotal moment, but it was before I like had that other realization about stress, right? So I guess your question was, what does that look like? I think it can look like, I've been really observing this in relationships. It can look like a husband that, let's say like you are unhappy in your career and you want to do some side hustle. And so you do a thing that can look like your family, your husband, whatever, not supporting you, not believing in you. That's like this unconscious message of like, I don't feel believed in, I don't feel safe, etc. Like, how many people is that? Right? Like, that's a lot of people. So it just kind of looks a little different for everyone. And if we don't kind of stop and say like, and you can kind of tell that, like, how much am I comfortable? Like, what happens when our nervous system starts to feel unsafe is like, well, maybe I'm going to shy away from XYZ thing. So look at the things that you shy away from in your life, because those might be the things that are like causing stress, pain, etc. I think you asked me, Abby, about some way making this tangible or making it work for every individual person. And there's an exercise I like to go through periodically to help me identify what is like unconsciously causing a lot of stress that I didn't really realize. So I'm going to share that if that's okay with you guys.
Please.
That'd be amazing.
So I just recommend like you take a piece of paper out and you draw a line down the middle. And on one side you write like, what really fills my cup? What brings me joy? What's kind of lighting me up right now? Like, these are my cup filling things that I like love in life. And on the other side, you make a list, and you can kind of put this in any context you want. You can put it in work, business, whatever. You can just like do regular life, right? I think that's the best place to start, like, because that's the biggest picture. And then the other side, put like vampire, energy vampire, things that like are draining my cup, things like I'm dreading. It's like a dread list and a look forward to list, maybe. Things that like are just killing my energy, right? So once you take a moment to, sometimes you don't think you have something to add to this, but put pen to paper as part of a neuroplasticity exercise, by the way, like as an opportunity, and to help you shift from like one side to the other. So it's just like sneaky little things, but you can do this exercise and like fill this out as honestly as you can. And then you look at it and you're like, oh my gosh, sometimes until you put that on paper, you didn't really realize all the crap that was taking up all this space in your brain. And then you can say, can I get rid of that? And if the answer is no, the answer is why, right? Because who's in charge of your life more than anything, right? So, or like if you can't get rid of it, like let's pretend that this is a real example, because it is, that I have a second child who like challenges my nervous system like crazy, right? Challenges it so hard. And so I'm like looking for options that are on me of what I can do, right? Because we can only change ourselves, because our relationship with ourselves is now going to be a mirror to our relationship with others, right? And maybe she really is just like me, the worst versions of me, right? And so maybe there's a reason that happened. So that's my fun exercise, is like energy vampire and like what's filling my cup. And then I take that and I'm like, do I really need to do those things? Or can it like, could I rearrange, could I rejigger this and like come up with something better? So those are like, until you lay it out and kind of have an honest conversation with yourself, you don't really know what you're totally capable of or achieve. And I think that's the worst case scenario, is that you're in this disempowered state of, I can't do anything. I can't help anyone that can't do anything, right? Like no one else is going to do it for you. And that's a case with like everything, but especially your health, right? Like we are responsible for ourselves, unfortunately, or fortunately. I don't know if it's like always positive or negative. Sometimes there's all this stuff, right? Where people are like, oh, I'm angry that my doctor didn't draw blah, 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 blah. I'm like, well, that's fine. But like, they're working on a bunch of people. You're just working on yourself. So like, you're pretty much the only one who cares about how you feel more than anyone else. So you have to like, we can look at it as an opportunity that we're the only one responsible for our emotions and feelings and nervous system, or we can look at it as a worst case scenario catastrophizing. It's a perception, which was your original question. Everything is a perception, right? And so it's like, well, what if I just flip the perception and I take things off my plate, or I get rid of all of this energy sucking stuff? Like if we just did that, I'm pretty sure all of our lives are transformed. And so what I find is that I have to redo that exercise pretty frequently because I have toxic traits. And one of them is to overfill my plate, like to death, so I have to do that kind of stuff.
Relatable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are we all?
I love, right. I love the, kind of tangibleness of that exercise. And even with you mentioning, as a functional practitioner that is in the weeds doing this work with clients day to day, I love that you mentioned, like, you revisit this regularly. It's not just something that you do once and then you say, all right, I'm good, don't have to revisit that again. So I love that it's a tangible exercise, but also that you're mentioning that it's kind of a practice to revisit and continue to kind of check in with yourself and to create that awareness on an ongoing basis. And it's also really powerful and empowering to think about that, kind of muscle analogy that you gave earlier in terms of, thinking about the nervous system and getting into that, rest and digest parasympathetic state as, it's an active ongoing process. It's not sort of like a one-time flip of the switch. So there's, kind of a few layers to this, it seems like. And, the first step is creating that awareness, and then it's the practice of, making shifts and creating change. But I think for anyone, which is probably most of us, that can relate to just like sometimes the overwhelm of day to day, feeling like, how do I get started? What do I do first? So I just really love that exercise and encourage, everyone in our audience to try that. We actually did that exact exercise at a presentation that Christa gave to a big group of us back in the fall. And I was like, man, I need to do this more often.
I don't really know where that exercise came from. I don't know if I made that up. I really don't know where it came from, but I've used that not only in presentations, like it's funny because I'm like, when I looked at my notes for that presentation, I was like, oh yeah, I talk about this kind of stuff all of the time. Sometimes I'm not really sure who's even heard this, but I just think it's so simple and it's so free. And until you evaluate, you just described, Jillian, exactly what I think is the process to healing, which is awareness, which can come in all types. And to be honest, if you're running from thing to thing to thing, you don't have a damn bit of awareness, right? Like you are too in the weeds too much. You must, this is why we have a weekend, right? So if you cannot, I would say like if you cannot unplug at all in the weekend, like your weekend is so full, you are automatically in the bucket of needing to support stress chemistry, stress organs, the things that are affected by it. Like there's a lot we can do to improve our resilience, but there's just certain things. Like someone emailed me and she said, I'm in debt from the last program I was in, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, well, I can already tell by the very short version of this email that you should not work with someone else and that you should work on your nervous system first because no one's going to do that for you, right? Mm-hmm. And so I gave her some things she could do every day. The last time I did that, someone emailed me a month later and she's like, oh, I'm like healing. I'm like, that is funny how that works, right? But we tend to undervalue the things that we can do for free. So sometimes we skip over them in lieu of the fancy things, which we're all guilty of and we see frequently, right? And so sometimes I think a good clinician is being able to see between the trees for the big picture forest. Otherwise, we're not invested. I'm like one of the lenses. So two things. One of the lenses I use to filter decisions for my life and my business, mostly for my business, is this in best service to the client? But I have a second filter because I would like to be able to serve people longer term. And if I only use the filter, what's in best service to my client, it would also result in burnout for Christa because, it's a take world. It is. So that second lens that I use is without burning me out. So I must use both, like my decisions must qualify under both of those things in order for me to move. Because I know what I want, like big picture now, because I've taken some space to determine, do I love what I'm doing? Yes. Do I want to do it long-term? Yes. But do I want to be burned out? No. So what are my options to do that? And the tricky part is that not everyone has certain options, but you can change how your nervous system is processing things, I would say. And so one more thing I want to say is that you brought this up, Jillian, and I started to yap about it and then I digressed, is that awareness is the first step, and awareness can come in the form of assessment, like that exercise, the right side and the left side, writing all that down. It can come in from a functional perspective, from like our health perspective, looking at it from symptoms and testing. I always think symptoms weigh more than testing, in my opinion, because tests are imperfect. Tests are cool though, but they're imperfect. So symptoms and just understanding how those can kind of overlap and what they tell you. And then you said, you use different words, but I'm going to call it the work or the action. Like, it's like, here, once you know what the problem is, you can now take action on that and do the things. And then the last step for me is empowerment, because once you've experienced success, that's your best educator. And so the end goal is to be empowered, because the most disempowered state looks like, well, this is just how it's going to be. And I'm like, well, I can't change that for you. You have to start to change that perception. So bit of another tangent there. I'll turn that back to you to refocus me here.
Well, and that actually kind of reminds me of something you say often, Abby, in terms of making that shift. And I'm probably going to butcher this, so you can feel free to hop in, but around, this is happening to me versus this is happening for me, right? Where sometimes I think, it's easy to feel like, oh my gosh, all these things are just happening to me. And, this person is doing that and that person is doing this thing. But even just reframing the story and kind of calling that out, I think can be so powerful. And I think that's the way that you say it, right?
Oh yeah. That like, I love that, like the two lens, kind of that idea of, like what can I take from this that's actually like helping me to identify, like that idea, I think, Christa, that you were just saying, like, I think about that oxygen mask that people, that kind of idea of like, can I put my own oxygen mask on first? And I think a lot about like moms who are, they're like, well, I can't, to your point, like, I can't like toss my second child up, and just be like, nope, we're just not gonna like, even though you're challenging to my nervous system, like you're my child, so I'm going to show up for you. But how can I also show up for myself? And, I could be in this disempowered place of like catastrophic thinking, things are happening to me. Or I can think about like through that second lens of like, how can I support, my family in this example, but also how can I support myself, because I'm the one that is, showing up so much for my family. And it's like that, oxygen mask piece. And sometimes it might just be like a practice of like a gratitude practice in the morning, where it's like, do we have to take even more on in order to like put some stuff down? Like, not necessarily, but shifting that perspective, even just around, and we've talked about gratitude practices before. And I think of like my Coco love, your Mowgli love, like, Christa, I'm not like your love, but like just whatever.
Chicken love.
Yeah.
Chicken
love. Exactly. Like that feeling of, what lights me up in my like heart center, wherever it kind of comes for you. And that's so much of what I was thinking when you were just kind of sharing those two lenses, and that idea of like allowing us to connect with what it is that we're actually doing versus just like, I checked the box. Jillian and I, before we jumped on today, we're like kind of joking about the memes of like people doing like, and I'm doing my stupid little walks for my stupid mental health. And it's like, well, when we do them in that way, like, are we really showing up for our nervous system truly? It's like, we do have to be connected to what we're doing. And that's ultimately like, no matter what it is that you're doing, like unicycling or feeding your chickens or like jumping out of the sky, like if it brings you joy and like lights you up, then like that's part of your practice.
Yeah, it is part of the practice. I like what you said there about not adding things to the plate. I find that first we have to assess what needs to be removed. And then I think also, instead of creating such mountains all the time, it's like really identifying the very subtle piece, because there's perfection, which is like 99% of the time never going to happen. And then there's like, what's the bare minimum to make me start off in a good way? And so for a lot of people, that's like going to pour that cup of coffee and having a little silence. I mean, for me, and when I think about, I really like the analogy of put your own oxygen mask on first. It's just like, sometimes we just need a new visual of like, duh, of course, but right. And so I always think that we live our lives very reactively, as evidenced by, I get a notification, I reach over and grab it. That is forming neural pathways and triggering our, like, it's exercising the side that is like more fight or flight and more reactionary, right? And so the other option is to be a little more proactive. And for me, being proactive, like just give me like a few minutes to myself in the morning. And there's a tricky time about 1 year postpartum where this is a real challenge. That I would say, like, accept it during that time that you're in a season. But when it becomes 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, and it's always you're dragging to get up, or always your kids are waking you up, maybe there's something else to be optimized as well. And that's okay. So there's like the physical components of what stress looks like. We've talked a ton about sort of about how our nervous system is interpreting stress, but there's other versions of stress that the nervous system is also going to interpret as not safety or issues or whatever. And so I kind of put those into like buckets and lenses, because we've talked like a lot of stuff we talked about today. We tried to make it like the untangible tangible, which is always, a good charge for us to do. Like, that's the tricky part. It's like, how do you resonate? How do you make this land for people so they put some effort around it? But there are times where it's like, well, I think you could use a little other support, right? Or like, I can't quite get out of bed, or I just kind of have like not awesome energy all day. Then I think it's time to look at some of the other stresses that are happening in the body, or some of the other lenses in which we can look at stress, which we can talk about if you want.
We would love to.
Okay.
Could you talk about some of those specifically?
So I'm always looking for ways to make things like a little easier to understand, which I have not mastered with the last 45 minutes of what we're talking about yet. Like, give me some time here. Give me some time. It's my latest endeavor. But like, for a long time, I've talked about this like health triad. I think I made this up too. I'm not really sure. Sometimes, we're not sure where we're a culmination of everything we've ever been touched by. So I think that you can look at the stressors, or I think you can put like kind of any glasses on this or lenses on this to look at this. But anyway, I think that these are like in angles, or like different kind of realms, angles, et cetera, like to health, different angles of health in terms of, or the lens of stress. So one angle, and this might be like, if you have back pain, you could also do this. We can run this through like more tangible examples, but stressors or symptoms can be filtered through these lenses. So one is the nutritional angle, one is the emotional and nervous system angle, and the other one is structural. When I'm looking at skin stuff, I might call the structural one either environmental, I might call it like structural in terms of skin integrity, or topical or external. And then the other side might be internal or nutritional, basically. So let's take this through a couple examples. If you have back pain, what have you probably tried? You may have done some structural interventions, right? You may have been like, I've tried everything. I've gone to the back pain doctor. I've gone to the chiropractor. I've gone to the physical therapist. So those are all structural interventions, and they are necessary, right? They impact what's going on with your nervous system too, on that note, right? But then if someone comes to me, I'm going to look at more the nutritional angle. So I might see what are some things that are going to inflict or exacerbate pain mediators and mechanisms. So that can be anything in the nutrition realm, right? It can be any of these barriers that we sometimes remove, toxic burden, gut imbalances, et cetera. There's a bit of a tangent there. And then sometimes, but not often, people will sometimes look at that emotional piece. And I think there's more and more of an intersection there. I had a back surgeon on my podcast a long, long time ago. That was his whole thing. He was like, he was like really leaned into like where people were with the emotional piece, with the emotional angle. So even the guy given surgery is like, I don't think most people needed the surgery. Okay, let's use another example. So cool. It is cool. Let's use another example. Kid with emotional outbursts. So with a kid with emotional outbursts, you're going to start with emotional, right? You're going to be like, okay, therapist, counselor, there's a zillion other modalities, which I think is good, and we should give some more airtime to. And then maybe they're going to go to chiropractor or a physical therapist, right? Because people talk about that. They're like, oh, your kid's, acting up. You should go get them adjusted, because that can pinch, what's going on with the nervous system, and in fact, what's going on emotionally, mentally, whatever, right? And then maybe lastly, they might visit an office like mine, right? Or an office like yours. And they might look for like, okay, well, I've heard that like gut dysbiosis can be related to mood stuff, right? And so they might look at that last. We tend to go what makes the most sense first, right? So an emotional struggle, you go at that corner. A physical struggle, you go at that corner. similarly with skin, it's like external topical. It's like, oh, I start with like the most obvious thing, that I do this obvious external whatever. And so there's a lot of things we can do in each angle or each realm. And so sometimes when I'm trying to come up with or like streamline or simplify how we are approaching things, I ask people to think about it in those types of lenses. Because especially with skin stuff, people will say, well, I've tried everything. It's like they've usually tried a whole bunch of stuff in the external or structural realm, right? Like topicals, maybe change some environmental things, maybe change laundry detergent. That's great. But they really hadn't done much in the nutritional side, except maybe some food restriction, maybe not, right? There's a lot of opportunities of other things you can do in the nutritional angle. So I think that helps, one, negate the conversation, like I have tried everything, because I've never actually witnessed that. I think there's always opportunity, which is a perception that there's always more to do, can be, oh my gosh, there's always more to do, or it can be, isn't that cool that there's always more to do? Like it's a perception. And so we can kind of apply these things to anything. We can use any type of condition or put that lens on it, and there's opportunity in every single corner or angle of the health triad.
And I love the idea of seeing it as opportunity. And again, making that shift from overwhelm and the to-do list and, oh my gosh, there's just more things, to, wow, there's actually more opportunity for me to support my body, my nervous system, to support healing, and kind of bringing it back to the fact that it is an ongoing process. Doesn't mean people should be struggling with symptoms for forever, but there's a lot of layers to this, and it's just really interesting how you break that down too, because I really do think pretty much every condition out there could kind of fit into that triangle, and there's likely gaps with all of these kind of conditions in terms of, like you said, there's the obvious thing first, but then maybe we're neglecting this entire, nutrition element or this entire other element. And, for anyone out there that is struggling with symptoms or, stress, the nervous system, hopefully it's encouraging to kind of see that opportunity in terms of, okay, there's maybe some things that I haven't explored yet that could be really supportive for my body.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's always my mantra, is that you always have things you can do that should feel empowering and not disempowering. I think sometimes if our perception, you can just tell a lot about, like, you can in 2 sentences sometimes kind of tell, like, oh, looks like we've got to prioritize your adrenals and all your stress organs because of where your foundation is, right? If your foundation is like worst case scenario all the time, or like, oh, woe is me, then we already know that your nervous system. So it's really tricky because sometimes, and this is pretty common, like the people who would need nervous system support the most, they can't always find the time to be touched by that, right? And so that's the tricky part. And that's, kind of my constant MO, right? Or something I'm always working on, because unfortunately I am and was that person, right? And we're all a work in progress. And so it was like the awareness train had to hit me like a few times from different angles before I could know. And then I still have to be reevaluating, because we have patterns and tendencies, and we tend to like slip into old patterns and tendencies. And that's not necessarily like my expertise area, but I sure can recognize it in people. And so it's just a tricky thing on like, how do you help people see that, understand that? But just the way you talk about, like, just listen to yourself. If you could just record yourself speaking, you can tell a lot about where someone is on the nervous system scale, like that they may need it. And people kind of, sometimes we all resonate with different ways of information being presented, right? So like some of my favorite Instagram posts or things that pop up are like, stress can look like this, but it can also look like, running from thing to thing to thing, or thinking about X person for this long, right? Like that's, or like something that's kind of like taking up. It's really good to take inventory. The reason that writing exercise is so good sometimes is because you now put on paper the thing that was taking up all that rent-free space in your brain that you didn't really realize was doing that. I had something like that last week. I mean, it's like, we're not impenetrable to this. So I had something like that last week and there was no reason for it. Like I could have, but I just like let it kind of ferment and think about it. And then I addressed it this morning. It was literally no issue at all. It was fine. But it was like my perception, or like the lead up to like, oh, I gotta find time to like call this and do this stuff. And so it's just, and like literally that's like me with my tax papers on my desk right now. It's like, oh, the anticipation of this is harder than the real thing, right? So
that feeling of anticipation and like overwhelm, I think is so much of like what's actually going on. And those practices, I mean, I think that the activity that you shared of kind of dividing that piece of paper is like so helpful to take stock. are there like other practices that you're finding to be like most effective for people to, be able to start supporting their nervous system? I know it's kind of a loaded question, but maybe some like
it is kind of a loaded
beginner
question.
things.
I'm going to answer it with a bit of a story, if that's okay.
I wouldn't have it any other way.
Yeah, right. So,
Please do.
So I went through some coaching probably a year and a half, 2 years ago. And that coach was a very qualified life coach. And they use the cognitive behavioral triangle, which your thoughts create your actions, create your results. And she was just so good at taking anything that was on my brain that day. Cause I was like, oh, there's no way we're going to have this much to talk about. Right. Like, and I think I had even tried some like therapy stuff, and this was really not. In fact, recently I had someone identify the difference between therapy and coaching. And I hope this is not offensive because I think both can be really useful. It's just a matter of where you are in time. And the tricky part is that the coaching industry isn't very, like, again, with anyone, like with us as dietitians, you would get very different vibes from every individual person you work with. Therapists, you get very different vibes. They're a culmination of what their experiences have been. I had just interviewed a therapist, and her whole thing is around like anxiety in kids. And until she had her own kid with like crazy anxiety, she was like, I am not doing, like, I really don't know what I'm doing in this area. Right. So it's like experience that tells you the most. And that's every practitioner, right? So people are always pissed at their doctors for not knowing X, Y, Z. I'm like, well, they haven't experienced it, or they're going through it themselves and haven't figured it out themselves. Like, it just is what it is. So I'm just going to give you this quick little thing. So this coach said, therapy is kind of like sitting in your shit, which is a bit of a challenge. Like you might need to do that for a while, but at some point, maybe you need to not do that if you're really working on changing the neural pathways instead of reliving this old stuff. Like it's nice to bring that out. But then coaching is like, so what, now what? And I think there's like a level of both that maybe people would need. So anyway, I worked with this really effective coach who had some really good training, and she was pulling that out of me. And I realized at the end of that, or in the middle of it, like, wow, my nervous system feels like my body feels different. Like I am just like not going into things with like stress and anticipation as much, like stuff I didn't really know was an issue. And so this was tricky because that was a pretty expensive endeavor and took 6 months. And I'm like, ooh, how do you like get this in the hands of people more quickly? So then I spent the next year and a half to 2 years really just experimenting all the things, like from mushrooms to what do we call this? Psychics. Like I was like, I will try all the things. Like, let me try the things. How do we help people get better faster? And so most of the best things in life are free. And I will just tell you, just like that writing exercise, there's a ton of neuroplasticity activities you can do on the day-to-day. I have, as we all have, explored different neuroplasticity devices. I now own 4 of them. I recommend them regularly. I basically, if my client's like, oh, I'm really busy, I don't have time, blah, 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 or whatever, I'm like, you need this thing. Like you must get a thing to vibrate on your arm, in your ear, or whatever, and stimulate your vagus nerve and parasympathetic nervous system device. So that's a graduated version, but I will just like straight up tell people like, no, this is why you should do this. And this is what other clients have had experience with. And you're not like, it's just, if you can like be trying to do meditation for 5 minutes, and like me, you may be like, oh, I suck at this. But that's part of the, like, here's your sign, right? Like, so that's part of the issue. You can't negate the other 23 hours and 55 minutes with like 5 minutes of a thing. And not that that's meant to be like negative. It's just like, well, look at, like, what are my options? My point is that there are a lot of neuroplasticity opportunities or options. They include journaling, gratitude practice, some kind of breath work, reframing exercises, right? So like whether you have to work with someone, and there's all these like tools and like devices and gadgets that can help assist with this. So it's almost like, wouldn't this be cool? Lifting weights on autopilot for your nervous system. And it's like, well, that, like, I've had people doing all this self-care stuff and like add that, and then they're like, oh, I am dramatically different. Like I can now sleep. And like people who were like, well, I don't think I have stress. Oh, now I can sleep. Now my digestion's even better. Now that anxiety that was on my chest when I had my business open today is no longer there, right? Like these are just out of the words of my clients, right? When we add those other tools. One undercut thing that I really like is if you can step outside in nature and walk through your senses, it's called a body scan. And so you're just kind of assessing, and you can like YouTube body scans. I actually really like this practice, and I think this is a really good one for people to explore. And again, your personality type is going to gravitate to that or away from that. And that's okay. Just take inventory now. If it's makes you prickly and you're like, nope, I'm going to pass on that. Okay, cool. You probably need something a little bit next level. That's fine. Cause you're probably like, I like to, I'm not trying to stereotype. Like I have a husband like this, right? He's an Enneagram 8 and like we do not. And Enneagram 3 is like, neither one of us like to be in touch with our feelings. Real exciting for our lives. But anyway, body scan. So what you do is you walk through the senses that you have, right? And so like if you're standing outside, or you can do it with anything. It's like, what do I see right now? What do I hear right now? What do I taste right now? What do I smell right now? What do I feel right now? And we can kind of walk through our body and like we can kind of go head to toe, and that's body scan with those 5 senses. And what that does is it turns off all these like constant danger safety stuff and kind of turns your attention inward to where you're just assessing how you are feeling, and kind of instantly turns on parasympathetic nervous state. So I think that, again, as I talk about like being careful with triggers and whatnot, turn off the notifications, turn on the intermediate alarms of positivity and like, hey, can you do a body scan right now? Something like that, right? Like turn off the things that are making you really reactive and turn on the things that allow you to kind of tune in to self, and then experiment like hell, right? I had an accidental, I don't know if it was last week, an accidental week, like kind of recently. I really like wrestle with like, would I rather be packed, back to back to back for like a handful of appointments and just do my thing? Cause that's my like pattern, my tendency, how I've always done things. Or what happens if I give myself a little margin in between that I wasn't expecting? So I had like more margin in between and I was like, whoa, I was like, really? Like I was like much better than usual at the end of the day, right? And so it's just little subtle things. But my point is that neuroplasticity practices, most of them are free. You can always get a little fancier, right? You can always get fancier, but a lot of stuff is free. And so I always like to take advantage of like, what are free, simple things that you can do that are, and I think first assessing what your day looks like and how you feel throughout the day. Like what is my like core feeling at different parts of my day, and how do I feel? Like really this is a take inventory. You can do the exercise where you draw the line into, but then also just looking at the day and saying like, how was it when I woke up? What was that like? And do that for a few days and kind of see what are those core moods or energy or whatever that you're observing about yourself. And then you can kind of make some tweaks around that, I guess. So it's really back to what Jillian had underlined earlier, which is my favorite first step, which is awareness. So if we don't even have time for awareness, that is a bit of a challenge. So I'm going to encourage you, if you're listening to a podcast, like I'm going to encourage you to the free, and call you to the awareness piece, etc. We tend to start to look for answers outside of ourselves and like look for someone else to give us an easy button. There are like some versions of easy buttons, right? But a lot of it, like you have to do something, because you've got to create a new foundation, especially if your existing foundation you've had for your entire life is kind of this like, if my parents were always like coming up with the worst case scenario, what was that telling my nervous system that I was just so used to? They're like, well, if you're out this late, or like literally like worst case on everything. I just did not even recognize it until I was away from it. As another just aside, like on a similar but different note, about once a year, I accidentally end up in like a no service area space. And it's really incredible what it does to the neural pathways of reaching for my phone, et cetera, right? And so can you do that on your own on a weekend, or what can you turn off? So sometimes if I notice I'm really addicted to like certain notifications, because we start to do that again and again and again, I just go turn that off for a while and see if I can like reprogram. Like really it's awareness. I'm like, oh, I'm like really like reacting a bunch. What can I turn off to try to break that habit? What app could I delete for a little while to try to break that habit for a while? And it'll always be there. And like, it'll be there just like it was before and nothing will go wrong. Right. So anyway, those are some little things that I think are fine to consider. And I don't know, I just went through a lot of like free options, a body scan, breathwork stuff, journaling stuff, gratitude practice, but then really like an inventory. It'd be great if we had a list of like an inventory of like little things that you could do, which again, all the nervous system stuff for me, I guess I tried all those things. I landed on, we're all familiar with this, I landed on a particular breathwork practice that I found really useful because it allowed people to be in charge of their own like destiny. Like that sounds really big, but destiny. They like, it gave them their own answers, because people can tell you the answers all you want, but as humans, we're going to do what we want anyway. So sometimes it's okay. 95% of the time, it's better if you sometimes come up with your own answer on certain things related to your nervous system, especially. And so I kind of got into that because if you oxygenate your cells, so this is like where my science brain gets excited. I'm like, oh my gosh, you can do this for free. So if you oxygenate your cells, you improve ATP production like by 15 times. So like like a non-oxygen state, like ATP production is like 2 units, and like in an oxygenated state. So like if you're really like doing breathing, like oxygen dysfunction is like such a huge issue, and breathing dysfunction is such a huge issue. And so like if we oxygenate cells, now ATP production can go up to 32 units in an oxygenated state. So thereby I can now heal my cellular adrenals or cellular status or improve upon it like up to 15 times by like just oxygenating properly with my like with breath work. Like, I don't know. So I need that kind of stuff. I also like it because I'm stimulating lymph, my diaphragm and my cisterna chyli or whatever. I can't remember what it's called, which is where like lymph dumps in, is like really kind of interwoven. And so if you're doing this like really intentional, like 360 breath. And so the tricky part is when you really need this stuff, you really struggle with it because your CO2 tolerance is really low. And so mine was too, you know, and I have a client right now and she used to be a swimming athlete, you know, and again, this is like 20 years ago, I could hold my breath 2 laps. Well, it doesn't really matter now if you're like anxious after 15 seconds, you know, trying to hold your breath sort of. So the answer to that is repeat exposure at your pace, right? You're improving upon that. And so isn't that always the thing? It's like the person who really needs this is not accessing it. But so anyway, I like breath work because it stimulates lymphatic flow, right? So that diaphragm will really stimulate that. So we're getting lymph, so we're getting drainage and detoxification. We're healing our adrenals because we're upregulating how our body can create ATP. Oh, there's one other one. Oh, and I'm exercising my parasympathetic nervous system side, AKA I'm flexing my muscles to become more neuroplastic or more flexible in life. So that way I can go from a stressful day to like chilling and like being able to eat lunch, right? with being able to digest. So it's like annoying how good it is. And it's like not a home run every single time, right? But that's something after trying all those modalities, I just landed on like, okay, well, this is what I'm going to bring to the clients because like it seems like the easiest, most effective way to like do the things I want to do, where they don't have to spend thousands of dollars on like more stuff, right? So that's kind of where I've landed, and I feel pretty cool with it. That's fine with me. So but I think there's a lot of opportunity to continue to develop nervous system resources. The problem is always, how do you make it sexy? Because I don't want people to miss this because they think that they don't have time, that it doesn't apply to them, et cetera. But I'm encouraged. I think like we're getting more awareness around this topic. We just have to use different terms and whatever. I'm still working on what that looks like. You know, for me, it's like, you know, this is like how you overcome burnout, right? Without like quitting everything. It's not about quitting everything. It's working on your personal resilience, and how you become resilient. It's like you have to strengthen this nerve. You got to strengthen this side of the nervous system. So,
and I think the point of that too, like kind of the breath work, and I think for people hearing this that are kind of like, wow, I know I need this, but maybe they're the people that are like, I don't have the time. I don't, you know, even just the topic might be overwhelming. That idea of doing, you know, it's really hard. You kind of mentioned at the beginning, like it's, you know, we are 95% like unconscious, and it's really hard to like tell our mind to like calm down with our mind. So when we go to the physical body, that's where we can use the physical body, like breath work, like, you know, kind of meditation, actual physical like rest, and these physical practices, even time in nature, can help to tell our mind to calm the F down. Right. Where, you know, it's really, I think for many of us that are wired to kind of go, it's like, all right, let me like use this, you know, piece of technology. Let me do this breath work. Let me do a practice that's physical based, because it makes it what is untangible much more tangible, and then we can kind of feel the after effects of it. So I like love that too. And I feel like you just came so full circle in like an awesome way of being like, and here's how we heal the adrenals through the practices that we're doing. And like,
right. It's almost annoying how awesome it can be, like what you can do for free, right? But it's like, how do I make you really interested in this so you're invested in it? And I have to think about my own journey was there too. It's like I did breath work with a coach and I did not form a habit, right? And then, so like if at first you don't succeed, just keep trying. That's like the bottom line, because I have done breathwork with like multiple coaches now, and I just like some forms better than others. And some people don't like the form that I offer, or they're open to like still being a little bit uncomfortable to give it another try, because I am like piecemealing in the functional breathwork stuff, which is like the science, right? And so that's how probably we are. It's like, tell me why it's good for me again. Okay, maybe I'll try it again for another like 20 minutes one time, right? So we're just humans. I always just say that, like, we are just humans. I am just as human as Abby is, and we all have like, we're all gonna trip it up, right? It's like we're all, if we aren't open to like working on stuff, we're kind of losing, right? Like that's like, I don't know. So it's just kind of the opportunities of life, so to speak.
And I think it feels more approachable in terms of the way you talk about like just experiment, right? Experiment, practice, and ultimately this will lead you to finding those genuine outlets or things that, you know, feel authentic for you in, you know, the variety of practices that you've shared. So I just feel like that makes it feel more approachable, where it's like, oh, you know, if meditation isn't your thing, it doesn't mean, you know, it's over and there's no support out there for you. It just means we need to continue, you know, experimenting, practicing, and finding those things that are supportive. And one thing that I want to call out too is what you said about like turning off notifications and kind of all of the stimulation that a lot of us don't even recognize is like jacking up the nervous system, you know, and just being so connected always. And maybe even just the kind of simple act of, all right, let me put, you know, the phone on do not disturb for an hour in the morning and an hour at night. Or maybe it's, you know, a whole weekend of disconnecting like you had described, which I will say, I don't know if you remember this, Christa, but one of the weekends that you were disconnected, accidentally out of service,
emergently needed me.
It was I emergently needed her, and she was disconnected on like some mountain. It wasn't an emergency at all, but you know, on a mountain biking adventure, I think. And I was trying to get a hold of Christa, and you know, she's usually responsive, and I didn't hear from her for like a day and a half. And I remember texting Abby being like, something happened, like something's wrong with Christa. And I'm like freaking out thinking you're like hurt or injured. And then I hear from you and you're like, I was mountain biking in the woods for the weekend.
Yeah, I didn't know I wasn't going to service there. So it was really like kind of accidental to that time. And that was funny because our other friend was like, oh, I was hoping like you were just out of service, but we were also kind of worried you were dead. So,
yeah, a little bit.
So, like, I mean, there's both sides. Like, hopefully you're having fun, but in case you're dead, this is going to suck. But I guess whatever. So I have to call myself out. You said call out, and I forgot because this is a different presentation, different audience that I've been talking about this in. But I forgot that like a big piece of my story on calling myself out, which was so crazy for me, was that I speak at a fast rate of pace. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but I talk a little bit fast, and I come by it honestly. If you meet my sister, one of my sisters, or my mom, and I haven't spent a lot of time around them, and I go around them, I'm like, oh, you guys all talk pretty fast and whatever. So I grew up like that. And that was a massive aha moment, that my rate of speaking was informing my nervous system, and it was increasing my heart rate. And so talk about something that's like, you don't even think could be an issue, and like how it was really massively affecting me. I had to like pull myself apart and like figure out how I was going to show up differently in this like calmer, slower state, which, you know, imagine that taking some time to like figure out, right? It's like crazy.
A little bit of time to.
Yeah. Right. And I'm not like perfect. Sometimes I'll be really wound up, and it's an excitement. I would say like, well, I'm not stressed, I'm excited. And that was true. But I'm still increasing the heart rate. And so what you were saying, Abby, about we can try to think our way into slowing down our heart rate as much as possible. But when we employ like a physical thing, but that can be simple, that can be free, or not, right? It just depends on how our preference is, or like what we're going to respond best to. Then we can actually, it's funny because it's like, it's an unconscious thing, but we can affect it technically with this physical input to affect an unconscious thing. So how freaking cool is that? So anyway, just, it's again, trying to make it tangible sounds a little goofy sometimes, right?
No, that's so interesting. And because how many of us are like, well, that's just the way I am. That's just like, I've always been
That's
this
like
way. My whole family's always been
statement.
this way. And you're like, well, is that the healthiest way for you to be? Or is that, is that the container, that kind of computer operating system that's over our subconscious? Like, is that how we were brought into this world to be? Or is that how we were wired in the world to be? And it's like, which one do we want to be most aligned with? Probably how we were brought into the world to be, and like how our body receives that messaging. And I was just, when you were describing like trialing different practices to see, kind of like try them on, see how they fit. Like I think about young kids, they say like for, picky eaters, it's like you have to give them like 15 exposures to the food before you can be like, oh, they actually don't like it. Okay. Like we are just big kids. And so it's like when you're like, well, I tried breath work and I didn't like it and it didn't work for me. It's like, okay, well, maybe you need to try it a bunch more times, because you could, we might need it so much that when we sometimes utilize some of these tools, like maybe they don't feel great, or it's like they don't feel like they're working per se. And I feel like the biggest and most loaded question I might ask is like, so somebody starts these practices, like how long does it take for them to work?
Oh, that's a great question, because I wonder that all the time, because I make up my own timeframes on things. So I actually really like to know what my ROI investment is. It's daily practice for 3 weeks. You see a difference.
Okay.
You can expect to invest 20 minutes a day, and after 3 weeks, you should be able to see a difference. There are different modalities you could use that can give you more bang for your buck. Like you can run them on autopilot in the background or whatever. You can get like it's a little stronger stimulation. But that said, and so like, how could you do that? The first time I realized this time frame, my friend asked me to do like a yoga thing with her on YouTube from Yoga by Adrienne or whatever. It was like 21 days. And because there's an emphasis on breathing differently, I was like, whoa, I feel different after 3 weeks. But that's what I find. And so when I charge people with do XYZ thing, I'm like, do this for 3 weeks. If you don't like it, return it. Or if you don't like it, do this, right? Like, because that's the actual time to ROI to really see a change. I asked that question to other people who are in like this space of being into this. And I would say that they pretty much agree as well. Like, yeah, you'll start to build new neural pathways immediately, but to see enough to create a change, like just plan on 20 minutes a day for 3 weeks. And if you don't put that investment in, then don't expect your outcome to be equal to your output or your effort goal. It's an effort goal. This is my like fun new thing. It's like, it's an effort goal, not the outcome goal. I got that from someone else too. That was not mine.
That's a good time frame to have. And then it's from there, it's the rest of our lives. Like, again, it's not like, all right, I did it for 20 minutes.
You're trying to build. Yeah, you're trying to build. Like, it's just like extra. It's just like a muscle. So the more you think about that, like strengthening that nervous system side, like a muscle, the better off you'll be. Because as physically, you can see it. You don't have the muscle or the strength if you like quit, right? It's actually after 48 hours, it starts to atrophy. Isn't that cute with muscles, right? I'm pretty sure that's right. That's what I remember anyway. So yeah, like the more you're off of something, the more you'll like relapse into old patterns and things. So I would say at like minimum, it would be good to like have some kind of check-in for yourself to just say like, where am I with stuff, right? When you, depending on what you're willing to do. That's all life amounts to, is what am I willing to do about this right now? So
I love it. So where can people find you as your wealth of information?
Well, you're listening to a podcast, so my preferred place would be come listen to my podcast. It's called The Less Stressed Life, and I have these lofty goals to just share the stuff I've learned in practice. And we've got great interviews, but I think it's like my favorite way to communicate with people is audio wise. And so, I mean, you can find me underneath Less Stressed Life podcast. You can find me on Instagram, anti-inflammatory nutritionist. You can find me at lessstressedlife.com or christabiegler.com. If we're doing stuff, which this will come out after the fact, but I am doing a breathwork class tomorrow, but of course this will be out later. But if I'm doing stuff, it's usually on christabiegler.com/links. That's where like all of my, that's the only page I update if I'm changing things up.
Amazing. And we've talked about a lot today. We've kind of, covered it all. And this is kind of a loaded question, but if you had to share kind of like one final message with our listeners as a takeaway from our talk today, what would that be?
Just that you always have options. So you always have options. You can always experiment. You can always explore things. Don't ever think like you're out of options, right? That's like they're very disempowered state. So like aim for the higher road. You always have options. And so like that's kind of a mantra I have is like, isn't that cool? You always have options. And if like you said, you try something on, if it doesn't fit, you can try on a different version of it. You can try it on again, see if it fits later, right? There's like, you have options. Even if you were introduced to them in 2009, like I was with HTMAs, and then decided to retry it on a few years ago or a couple of years ago.
I love that. It's got to be the right time. And there are always options, which again, I think the whole message today with this talk about stress in the nervous system has been, very tangible, really, really empowering in terms of, just giving people different ways to look at things, different options to explore. And we cannot thank you enough for, coming on here and sharing all of your brilliance with our listeners.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to yap about stuff. Hopefully they like it.